is more Doug DeMuro, and today we are going to talk about cars that are going to go up in value. Let's do it. Now, cars that are going to go up in value. People ask me this all the time. What cars are going to go up in value? And the truth is, I don't know. I really don't. But I can take some guesses based on what I know. I'm pretty obsessive following the collectible car market, probably more than I should be. I follow Bring a Trailer, I follow the auctions, sports car market. I look at all that stuff, and I always have a general idea of where most car values are. But I don't have a crystal ball, so mostly I'm just guessing for a lot of this stuff. But we'll see. Now, in the future, probably in the next couple weeks, I'm going to do a video on cars that I think are going to go down in value. We have had, over the last 5-10 years, we've had quite a run-up in collector car values, if you will. I wouldn't call it a bubble, because I think some cars are going to stay. But I don't think all cars are going to stay. So I will have a video on cars that I actually think are going to flop in the next few years. And before I get started and let you know what cars I think are going to go up, I want to tell you, none of these cars are going to go up more than actual investments. Even cars that increase 5-10% per year, there are still massive costs to owning a car. You have insurance, you have maintenance, you have fuel, and if you just let it sit, it won't be as valuable. You need to make sure you're maintaining it and that sort of thing, and those kind of eat away. So don't ever buy a car because you think it's going to go up in value. I try to buy cars that at least won't lose very much. But if you're ever buying a car as an investment to try to equal, the market or houses, cars will not be on that level unless you're playing in the really big leagues, $5 million, $10 million cars. And I suspect most of the people watching this video are not. All right, so let's start with the number one group of cars that I think is going to go up in value is old SUVs. And I don't say that just because I have an old SUV. I have a 1997 Land Rover Defender North American spec. I actually think that car is not going to go up in value. I think the NAS Defenders have kind of plateaued. They're selling for $80,000, $90,000 in some cases. It's ridiculous. They're rare. They're not that rare. They're cool. They're not that cool. I think the Defender has plateaued, but I don't think that of other old SUVs. Jeep Grand Wagoneer, FJ40 Land Cruiser, FJ60 and 62 Land Cruiser, even the 80 series Land Cruiser, Scouts, Broncos, the XJ Jeep Cherokees, Range Rover Classic, basically everything old SUV all the way up to the Lamborghini LM002, which has risen a lot already. They've all got further to go. Now, the reason I'm so sure about this with SUVs is that SUVs are really popular in the new car market. Consumers today, if they want a new car, they don't go look at a Mazda 3, they look at a Mazda CX-5. They don't look at a Camry, they look at a Highlander. And so SUVs have really blown up in the regular car market. And so as a result, it's cool to have a collectible kind of old school version of something that, normal people have. It's that I was there first kind of mentality. A Grand Cherokee driver drives around, he sees a Grand Wagoneer, and the Grand Cherokee driver knows, I got all the tech, I got the cooled seats, I got more power, more efficiency, but he's still thinking, man, that guy's cool. That guy is cool. And there is that component of, you have sort of an original, an old school version of all this common stuff now, and that is becoming really, really popular. So as SUVs have gone up in the regular market, SUVs have gone up in the collectible market. It's the same way that, a Corvette driver's driving around as a C7 and he sees a split window, and he knows the C7's better in every way, but he still wants that split window. And that's what's happening, in my opinion, in the SUV world right now. And it's helped by the fact that, collectible SUVs are pretty practical. In the past, if you had a collector's car, a Corvette, something like that, you couldn't take the whole family, but you can put the whole family in a Grand Wagoneer. So you can have a collectible car and still be practical and go places and that sort of thing, and that's a real benefit. So I think old SUVs are going to go up. Some old SUVs have gone up already. Broncos have. But in my opinion, there is a long, long way to go, and you're going to see a lot of this stuff bringing real money soon. I really think there's going to be a world where nice FJ40 and FJ60 Land Cruisers are $100,000 vehicles, just in the same way that muscle cars were when we all thought they were just used cars, and then suddenly they're really valuable. I really think that's going to happen to old SUVs in nice shape, the few that are left. And by the way, that's another thing that helps old SUVs. A lot of them were just used. They were driven hard, they were driven off-road, they were used as family transport, driven 200,000 miles. And so the ones that are still in nice shape, they're going up. I mean it. Number two, next group of cars I think is going to go up is special cars from the late 90s and early to mid 2000s. And I don't say this just because I have a special car from the mid-2000s, my Ford GT. In fact, I think Ford GT prices have kind of plateaued as well. GTs are now like 200 minimum for a really rough one with maybe an accident, to the 500s for like a really heritage model. I just don't see those ever going up really more than that. Is a Ford GT really ever going to be a $500, $600, $700,000 car? It's just hard to believe. It has a Ford Focus turn signal stock. They're very cool, but they made 4,000 of them, and I just don't think that they're really going to go up much. But others will. And the reason I say this is that the early to mid 2000s, the late 90s was sort of a perfect era. It wasn't excessive technology like the cars that came later. Cars that began coming in the mid 2000s, late 2000s all have screens. And those screens look ridiculous by modern standards. You remember my video of the Aston Martin Lagonda. That is how 2009 screens are going to look in 2029. But there's that era where cars in the late 90s, early 2000s, they didn't have those screens. And you're thinking, well, okay, but cars in the 60s, 70s didn't either. Yeah, but those cars didn't perform all that well. And cars in the late 90s and early 2000s still had modern performance. Those cars were still doing 0 to 60 in 4 seconds. There are cars in that range. And so you have the combination of modern performance and this no technology that's going to start looking outdated. And that is a really good combination. And as a result, I think that the good cars from the late 90s, early 2000s, mid 90s, they are going to one day be revered like the 60s cars were. I think it's going to be looked at as sort of the end of an era, just as the muscle cars were the end of an era before fuel regulations. 90s, 2000s cars are the end of an era before hybridization and excessive technology in cars. I really think that. The best example of this, in my opinion, is the Porsche Carrera Gt. My favorite car of all time. I think this car is deeply undervalued, and I say this as someone who would love to have one. I can't afford one now. I certainly wouldn't be able to afford it if they went up. But they're selling for $600,000, $700,000, and I just think that's crazy. The worst F40 in the world is a $900,000 car. Nice ones bring 1.2, 1.3. Carrera GT is just as rare. They made the same number of them, and it's just as cool, and Carrera GT will go up. And that's the high end, but it's also true for low end stuff. E39 BMW M5. Right now you can get a ratty E39 M5 for $9 grand. You won't be able to in 2 years. Same for E46 M3. There were a lot that were abused, used hard, they're rough. The cheap ones are going to be gone, and the nice ones are going to be really expensive. Mark my words, not too long. We're even seeing it with late 90s AMG cars. The C43, the E55, those cars were stagnant at 10 grand forever. Well, nice ones are starting to creep back up. Now, interestingly, I don't actually see the same thing quite happening as much from Audis from this era. In the USA especially, the RS4 and the RS6 here in the USA, they were sold new, and then they were kind of abandoned. Audi never brought back the RS4 and the RS6. So they were kind of standalone cars with no future. They don't have a pedigree like the M5 or the M3. They kind of just feel like used cars. And the Audis from that early to mid 2000s had a lot of reliability issues too. It isn't just European stuff though. Other things from this era, I think a really nice C5 Z06 will someday be kind of a valuable car to have. Not a lot of people have preserved those. A lot were used as autocross cars. A lot were damaged. I think really nice C5 Z06s are going to be considered special one day before they got all the weird adornments and they started putting in automatics and convertible versions. The C5 Z06, manual only, coupe, built for performance, not excessive. That's going to be a special car. Maybe even the Terminator Mustang Cobra. Those were cool. Those were really, really cool. The difference there is Ford has continued making these ridiculous big V8 cars. They didn't really go to turbocharging and hybrids yet, but I could still see those going up. But I really think that late 90s, early 2000s era is going to go up and maybe will one day be considered one of the great eras in the car. And I think another reason this era will go up is buyer age. You know, people who were 20 in like early 2000s, late 90s, they're starting to get on. They're approaching 40 now. And, you know, they're starting to get money in their pockets. And so they want to buy stuff that they liked back when, you know, they were 20 and they couldn't afford it. And so that's the E39 M5, cars like that. And that's always kind of a driver of collectible values. When people who idolized something as teenagers finally could afford it, then they look around the market and they see a lot of electric cars and they're like, well, what if I went and got an E39 M5? And so they do. And that brings us to number 3, the final group of cars that I think is definitely going to go up in value, exotic cars from the 80s and 90s. I am absolutely shocked at how cheap 2 specific cars are, the Ferrari Testarossa and the Lamborghini Diablo. Let me start by saying when I was a kid, I was very young in the 90s, but back then, vintage 1960s Ferraris, they were cheap. They were like $100,000, $200,000 maybe. Some were selling for $30,000, $40,000. Now all that stuff is $1 million plus. And what happened is people who were 20 in the 1960s, when those cars were new, well, 30 years later, it's the 90s, and these people become 50, and they become 60, and they're retiring, and they have a lot of money, and they realize they're going to die. And they're like, let's spend it. And so they go out and buy Lusos, and so there's this competition intensifies for all these cars that were cool in the 60s, and that's why these things start to become more and more valuable. So first the 60s Ferraris went up at 250 short wheelbases. Those are $10 million cars now. And people who idolize them start to buy it. And then the 70s Ferraris go up. The Daytona, the 365 GTC4, the Boxer. Those cars all started to shoot up as people from that era started to appreciate them. And eventually, it's just a wave. And eventually, it's going to be the 80s stuff. It's going to catch up. I think it is truly criminal how cheap early Lamborghini Diablos are. You can get one for like the low 100s, way under 150. And I think that's insane in a world where the Countach is selling for 260, 270 minimum. The Countach is definitely the cooler car, but is it double? Come on, I think the triple even. I think the Diablo is so undervalued, maybe the most undervalued car in existence right now. Testarossa is the same, crazy looking. Both of those cars have some pretty serious reliability issues, but compared to carbureted stuff from the 70s that's big money now, I just think Testarossa and Countach are super undervalued, and we're going to see that in the next 5-10 years. Now, those are the two obvious ones from that era, but there are others. Special Porsches from this era are already starting to go up, 964 Turbo, but I think there's more. 959 I think will go higher. Those are $1 million right now. I think that's going to be twice that. F40 also, they're just too cheap. They just pretty much have to go up. And it's hard to believe I'm saying a F40 at $1.1 million is too cheap. But I look at some of these 60s Ferraris that are $5 million, and I know that people my age would rather have an F40. That was our icon. And it won't be forever that a 60s car is $5 million and an F40 is $1 million, mark my words. And it's more stuff than the F355. Those cars had a lot of reliability problems, but they're beautiful. They're becoming more sought after. 550 Maranello. All of my friends my age love the 550 Maranello. I think in 10, 20 years, when they can start to afford them, that is a car that's really going to start going up. I mean, you can get a nice Maranello right now for 80, 90. The market has really softened, and they won't stay in that range forever. I really think that. And there's going to be a lot of competition among people who are born in the 80s, 90s for those 550 Maranellos. That's that. Those are kind of the three classes of cars that I think are going to go up. Old SUVs, special cars from the late 90s and early 2000s, a very special era, and then 80s and 90s exotics. That's what I would suggest is going to go up. But again, do not invest your money in these cars. Don't go buy an E39 M5 thinking it's going to go up in value. Maybe it will if you hold it 50 years, but I guarantee if you just put your money in an index fund, it would do better. But if it's going to bring you some joy, buy one of those. Maybe you can drive it for a while and not lose anything or not lose much, which is better than going to the dealer and buying a new Ford Explorer or something like that. So anyway, that is my take on cars that I think are going to go up in value. I'm excited to do the cars that I think are going to go down in value and get a lot of angry emails from people who own those cars. That'll be coming sometime this month. And that's my look with a crystal ball into the future.